So yeah, I'm a front-end developer at Zengenti. Kind of my day-to-day will be building websites, but also it's kind of focusing on how to actually put your sites on Contensis. So I spend most of my a lot of my energy really like looking at both the end user and the editors on the system. So I want to try and make the whole editing experience like as efficient as possible. But yeah, there's a couple areas we'll cover. I'll do a brief history of the Wysiwyg. It's a pretty dry subject, so I'll try and go through fairly quickly. Why we currently use it, and why you might not need to with content types and entries. So the first thing I want to say is, in regards to the Wysiwyg, it's not the wrong solution by any means. So we still use the Wysiwyg kind of content pages on our Zengenti site. So it's not at all by saying like you're doing it wrong or anything like that. It's just to kind of show you some new ideas of how you could approach pages using content types and entries that you might not really thought of. So we talk about content types and entries for news, blogs, events, and things like that. So I want to show you today kind of the idea of how you could do it for just like your generic content pages and also landing pages and things like that. So yeah. So the Wysiwyg, just in case anyone hasn't heard of it, it's the what you see is what you get. So it's the kind of content editor that when you put your content in, it'll be indicative of what's actually outputted. The first one came in 1974. It was developed by Butler Lampson and Charles Simeon. Looked a bit something like that. It's kind of like a recreation of it. It was a document preparation program built for the Alto personal computer. It was called Bravo, the first piece of software. But essentially, it was made by a printing company, Xerox, so that you have a program that you can actually develop your like finished piece, and when you print it out, it replicates that exactly. It's to cut out that kind of process of having like a copywriter, and then you've got a drafter that has to go through and print it out and check it. So it's kind of revolutionary when it came out. Kind of moving a few years ahead, 1983, Charles, one of the developers, was then hired by Bill Gates. He went on to develop the first version of Word. And we kind of went through the years of like the different versions of Word. I wanted to show those, just kind of show how, even though there's been more controls added, not much has changed really since the 80s. So of like the core elements, it's all about being able to like lay out your text and images and things like that. They've just been extending that. And what's interesting is we moved from that kind of software from print to web applications. So the one that most people kind of know is Dreamweaver. That's the kind of first piece of software where you'll get kind of an indicative side-by-side view. So you've got your code, but you can actually just start with a Wysiwyg. So you've still got the kind of same controls that you would with this kind of like document preparation programs. The biggest thing about those is that they're designed for a fixed viewport. So when you're designing for an A4 piece of paper, you know the positioning and spacing you got to work with. Back when we were designing websites like 10 years ago, you were designing for a fixed frame. You might have like the 960 grid or something. So essentially an A4 piece of paper on the screen. You know all the places it can go and things like that. But nowadays, it's not just one viewport at all. It's vastly bigger than that. So it's all about moving away from that kind of fixed solution of a Wysiwyg page, designing your content. I try and think of it as if we didn't have that at all, and we came to this kind of the need of a program, and we've basically got the need to develop and add in pieces of content that can be available on different viewports, we wouldn't come to the Wysiwyg, we'd come to a different solution. And I think that would be closer to what we have with content types and entries. That's kind of what I want to show you. So this is the Contensis Wysiwyg. So does anyone recognize that kind of style? Got like a mixture of people. Essentially, this is what you'll be using for your like content template pages. So for your kind of generic content, a lot of your stuff will be put in here. This is just a real rough wireframe kind of showing that. So you've got your header and footer and things like that. So your actual editor would go here, and the green area with your placeholder, that's where your editor will be putting in the text, images, and things like that. So what you might have available, along with doing your text and your kind of generic like elements, you might have image gallery, video embed, form, social feed, drop-down list. So that's just kind of a handful of components I wanted to show you of what you might normally get with your generic content pages. So if I was to create that as a content type entry, this is the kind of editor you might now get. So your editor would go in here, be able to put a title. This is obviously really stripped back there's no other additional fields, no metadata or anything like that. But when your editor's putting in their content, they'll be putting in there, they go, I need a text area, they put it in there. I need an image gallery, things like that. So kind of going on, kind of echoing what the other guys were saying, these elements would have been designed for what your users need on your site. So the whole point of this is all about bringing focus, about managing content and not design. So my kind of experience working with different people in different industries, when they work in the Wysiwyg, it kind of draws their focus away from what they're actually writing, because they're kind of too worried about what it's going to look like on the output. But actually, it's all about how people digest that. And in a way that all that kind of design element should have been figured out first. So you don't really want your authors to be worried about, oh, should I write a line that? Should I wrap the text around that? Things like that. That should be sorted out for you. That's essentially, you want them to focus on exactly what content they need and what they're writing. So the kind of day-to-day, these aren't actual recorded, it's just kind of made up things of like the kind of things I talk to people about. So when I talk about going away from the generic Wysiwygs, people kind of get a bit worried because they feel confident with it. It's kind of a safety net. They kind of know how to work with it. They don't want to lose the control that they already have. How would you build pages? Things like that. When I was putting all this together, I kind of came across people might have seen this analogy before, but it's kind of the UX analogy for like figuring out what the right level of UI is. So the idea is if you give the person, your author, they've got this task to perform, and then you give them this level of control. That's the whole idea, is that they don't know how to approach it. So in a way, a Wysiwyg is, some elements might be like that, because they might just be focusing on one piece of content, but they've got a bit too much control, and it might draw their focus away from what they're actually trying to achieve. Whereas if you do the complete opposite and just give them the flip switch, obviously that's the stark kind of extreme comparison. But the whole thing is you've got one task to perform, there's your control, you don't give them 100. So in summary, it's all about having the right control. And basically it's just figuring out, yeah, with your content needs, you need this level. You might find that you actually do need the cockpit scenario, and that's fine. You might need the switch scenario, kind of thing. The whole idea is not throwing everything at it, kind of like to tick all the boxes. So that's where I'm trying to move away from that kind of mindset. So another section I wanted to kind of highlight is dynamic content. So we've put together imagine this is a real basic website. So you've got your home, landing page, you might have some news listing. You might create a content page for the level 2 content, following that kind of design I had before, and then the author just put in some content here. So you can see they got the yellow elements, you probably can't read them, but it's basically just like a web control image. You can see there's a little quote at the bottom there. One way you might have dynamic content is related across the site. You might have a related news articles feed in the sidebar, and that's just kind of being fed either manually or automatically, depending on the relationship. So if I was to take that kind of page structure in regards to what content's needed and turn it into, basically form that into a content type, these kind of elements might change into that. So the editor wouldn't actually see a page like that in that sense. It would be kind of the structured content view. This is just to highlight. Actually, those elements could turn into different sections. So that could be an entry component. You could have a related list, entry list, image carousel entry, quote entry. And this is kind of already echoing what's been mentioned before today, but let's take the image carousel entry. So let's say you've got a piece of content, you create entry through the content page content type. You might want to add an image carousel. You could actually create that image carousel as a completely separate entry and then just relate to it. The idea is you can then reuse that image carousel on 100 pages. Your author doesn't have to re-enter it every time. And then you can start to just bind other relationships to it. So an example, this is more about approaching a landing page kind of design. So this is the well-known Ludlow University. This is kind of a mock-up design we created a while back to kind of highlight modular design. You can see it's very trendy, broken up into different elements. Pretty modern with the kind of style. As a developer, I'd approach this kind of page and I look at that, and it kind of, the way I look at these kind of things, it kind of blurs to me in the sense I don't even read it. I just look at it and it's to like break it down into components. So I'd look at that and go, oh, okay, I can make that top bit. That could either be a component, I can make it a separate entry. So you've got your things like a header, feature content, masonry blocks, news and events listing, all those kind of things. That's how I visualize those different pages. If I was going to take all those components and put that into what could be a landing page content type, you might get something like this. Again, this is a real stripped back demo. But yeah, the editor would have the ability to put in a title, and you can see I've just put all the components within a composer field, basically allowing people to add each component. So they might create a new landing page and go, we need a hero banner, we need the social feeds here, put this here, and then you can easily move it around. If I take one, for example, I think it's the quote carousel. So if I just get one to go into more detail, so this kind of component, quite straightforward and quite, we see this on a lot of sites. So this actual element, you've got a background image, the quote, the source, and a little avatar. So if I was to create this using a component, which is what Rich Saunders was talking about before, so the elements I'd use a quote field within Contensis, profile image, and then banner image. That's essentially all those elements I'd need. So I've got a video example. So here I'm creating up a landing page. I've put in fields for the hero banner to kind of demonstrate it. The rest I've just left kind of placeholder so it doesn't get too long, so you can kind of just get a feel for it. But here I'm just adding in the feature text, motion blocks, and I'll chuck in the quote carousel. So you can see the component, the elements I've made in that component are now available. This is what I'm just going to chuck in genuine quote. Don't know if you can read it. It's Rocket 2018, has to be up there with the moon landing. Yep, very genuine. I wrote it. But yeah, this is kind of just show you the different elements from the component. So I'll save and publish that. I've got another example. The idea is if you wanted to then add another component to your page, so if you imagine that kind of Ludlow College, you might go, okay, I want to add a news and events listing, or you want to have it above the actual quote carousel component. You want to move it around. Obviously, these are just highlighting what they would look like, but that's kind of if you look at how the components and you imagine they're reshifting when you publish them out, that's kind of the idea and the benefit of it. So the other element, which I know Rich touched on before, with using related entries. So I wanted to kind of show another example, and this is focusing on the quote again. So here I've taken all of the fields that were in the quote component and actually created a separate content type. So it doesn't actually exist within a entry. It will be its own entry in that sense. So I've moved all of that content I created and put it into its own content type and save and publish that. And then the final kind of example for this, I'll go back to my actual landing page. There we go. So this time, you can see now it's just turned into a related entry field because I've changed it. And you can see I've got my quote there ready to use. And binding it to that will make it available on that page. But again, because it's its own existing entry, it's separate to that. So I'm actually going to add another one using inline entry that Rich talked about. This is a quote from Sweep. He's a long-serving employee at Zengenti. He says, "Where's my socks?" He's actually surprisingly hard to get a quote from because he spends most of the time sleeping. There he is. He's kind of the Zengenti mascot, and he generally does sit like that most of the day, which is hilarious. You can see I'm just basically demonstrating creating an inline entry with what I think might be a relevant piece of information because kind of everyone wants quotes on their sites. There you go. So that's saved and published an actual inline quote there. So like we were saying before, that again now exists in its own separate environment, so it's not just bound to the landing page. So if you had another landing page or you had 1,000 and you wanted to use the same quote, you just access those. The idea is that's just like a quick demo, but you could have 100 quotes made up or whatever it is. But creating those networks and like the relationships, that's where the power really starts to come in. And that's how I look at designs and look at the markup and I try and think, oh, actually, you might want to use that again on that site. I don't want you to edit that or re-enter it again. Let's create that its own entry and then create relationships through it. So another example is you might have that quote related to a profile. So when you actually write, when you've got the quote carousel, you can make the avatar clickable and that will go through to their profile. And vice versa, that's just like a 3-step relationship. So there's loads you can do with it. The last bit I kind of wanted to run through is just kind of touching briefly on the delivery API, kind of how I look at it from developer. So I've created another demo content type. So this is, imagine the Zengenti site or the marketing team wanted to push out a new marketing campaign. So they create a campaign content type. Here we just got title, message, destination, really vague and obviously a bit bleak, but the whole idea is just to put in a message, content delivered. We want to push that through to our different audiences. So kind of what we were saying with the Power of Delivery API, it's not limited to your kind of everyday use. So obviously we might push it out to your website content, that might be pretty standard. So here we'd have a developer actually write a bit of code to basically access the information through the delivery API and output it. But that's where the options kind of get bigger and bigger. So you can have phone applications, wearable tech applications, and then if you needed, you could even do things like a digital billboard. So the whole idea is it's not just bound to a generic website format. It's kind of the sky's the limit in that sense. So yeah, kind of summarize everything I've kind of been talking about. Essentially, there's 3 small steps to everything I've been putting here. The first one's all about content focus. So it's drawing the kind of attention away from the overall design piece for your authors. The whole idea is they've got to enter content, that is their focus, and you want them to retain their focus on that. Moving away from Wysiwyg to more structured pages, in my view, kind of enables that and encourages people to focus on the right areas. That going ahead to looking at component-led design, so how I kind of broke up that Ludlow college design, about how you can reuse and relate entries. That gets really powerful. And again, that's when you get into the realms of using the related entry power, of how you can create those relationships. Combine all of those with the new delivery API of how you can actually push it out to your audiences. Essentially, it's a giant leap of possibilities. Thanks.